Okay, at the bottom of Samach Gimel Beis, 63b. So I've just introduced the next, I think, 2-3 days will be the subject of Kachim of Tum and Tahara. And I would say it's not my strong point, so I'll do my best to manage through it. Okay, so you spoke about an example in the Mishnah of Tumas Hatohaim. That's the secret Tumah. The Mishnah gave an example where they found Tumah that was floating in a spring. He went into a cave to go to the mikvah, and he found Tumah that was floating. The Gemara says in that situation, that is not considered Tumas Hatohaim, and he's Tameh. He loses his Naziris, he has to restart his Naziris and end it again. Okay, so we're at 4 lines to the bottom of the page, 63b. Says the Gemara, Tzafa ein metame le'inyan sheretz. If you have a floating bug, a floating mouse, one of the types, 7 or 8 types of bugs that are tamei, and now obviously you went into a swimming pool or a mikvah with one of these floating bugs, and you don't know if you touched the bug. The Gemara says if it's floating, it is not tamei. The Tanya we learned, Safik Tumat Safa Ben Bekelim Ben Bekarka Tahara. If you have a floating bug, a floating sheretz, and you find it, whether you find it in a swimming pool or you find it in a large pot. In either scenario, we don't presume the pot is tamei. In other words, we presume it didn't touch the walls of the pot, and also we don't presume that anyone who is in the swimming pool is tamei either. Shimon says, "Bekelim tamei, bekarka tahara." With regard to vessels, we do presume it touched the walls of the vessels, so the vessel becomes tamei. However, bekarka in the ground, sort of spring, the swimming pool, a mikvah, tahara, anyone who was in that swimming pool is tahar. Okay, the Gemara says, what's the source? My time in Tanakama. What's the reason for Tanakama? The pasuk says, "B'chol hasharetz hasharetz." When the Torah talks about the tumah of a sheretz, a creeping creature, it says he has to be sheretz. I mean, he has to creep. It has to walk around. Kol makom shu sheretz. Where you'd think that that includes anywhere where this bug is crawling. Uchsiv, and the pasuk says as well, al haaretz. It says b'kol hasharetz al haaretz, meaning that there's a limitation on the type of sheretz, that it does. The type of moving is moving on the ground. Okay, tzad. What does this mean? Vade magetami, safik maget tahar. That means that if it's not on the ground, it's floating in the water. If you touch it in the water, you're tamei. But if it's a suffix, whether you touched it while it was floating in the water, you're tahar. Because the limitation here says that suffix tuma of when it's floating in the water is tahar. Reb Shimon, my time, what's the reason of Reb Shimon that kalim are different than karka? Vessels are different than if this happens on land, meaning if it floats in a swimming pool, not everybody who went swimming becomes tamei. Amar Ula, that Ula says, Ksiv ach mayin. So next to the parsha, next to the discussion of the different types of shrotzim that become tamei, we have a discussion of mikvah. It says a mayan will make somebody tahar, but somebody who touches the nevela will be tamei. What does this mean? Safa bekelim tamei, bekarka tahar. In other words, if the bug is floating, so in other words, you're talking about a mayan, a bar, a mikvah, makes it tahar. But if you touch a one of the 8 types of bugs, a mouse, you become tamei. Now, why is it in the same pasuk? To tell me as follows, that it makes a difference what type of floating they're doing. If they're floating in a mayan, a spring, or any other collection basin that's connected to the ground, so that's tahar. That's going to be tahar. But if they're in a vessel, they're in a large pot, and there's a mouse, running around the top or whatever, and it's not running anymore, it's dead. But if it's in a vessel, then we say Yitma becomes tummy, because we presume that it was negeb and iflos. Since the suffix tum of kalim, when you have a nevela that's safa, a floating bug, it's going to be tummy. In a something connected to the ground, it will be tahar. Okay. Now we're learning this halacha that if something is floating, it's tahar. What happens if somebody's pulling it? That's an exception. Tana Rabbanan. The rabbis taught kol hani tolen b'hani grorin sfeikan tummy. Again, I'm not sure why exactly this is going on, but apparently, in one scenario, a guy is dipping a mouse into the water. In another scenario, he's pulling the mouse across the top of the water. Pulling the mouse could, it's pretty. It would seem like he was cleaning the swimming pool. So if anyone's seen a mouse in the swimming pool, it happens. It's not like it does.
Sometimes they're still alive and they're swimming, which is actually kind of.
Yeah, I was a lifeguard for 6-7 years, and it's not. I've seen it a few times. And along with the frogs and whatever, all sorts of stuff.
This guy pulling the mouse across the water clearly needs a hobby or something better.
No, he was just cleaning out his swimming pool. So
I thought you said he's pulling the mouse. Well,
right. Yeah, it could be he was using his net to pull the mouse out. Okay. Where are we here? Okay, so if you're pulling them out, so then this is an exception. Since somebody's pulling it, it's not considered as if it's floating. Happens to be it's being pulled on the surface of water, but because it's being pulled, we don't view it as floating. Okay, the hand is rocking. Let's say they were being thrown. Kids are playing catch with it or something. 1 second. In that case, sfeik and tahar, the suffix is tahar, and that is it's floating through the air. It's not being. If somebody threw it, and we're not sure whether it touched somebody while it was being thrown, sfeik and tahar.
Well, had it touched the person who was throwing it.
The person threw it is probably is tummy. Now it could be he threw it without touching it. I believe sheretz is only mitama be maga, which means you have to touch it. If you didn't touch it, you wouldn't. I think you wouldn't be tummy.
If you throw it,
you can throw it with a stick or something.
Oh, something.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Or maybe
You throw it.
Yeah, something like that.
Throw it. Oh,
So if it's being thrown, that's called floating, and then the suffix is tahar. Chutz min kizayas hames. The exception to this rule is this is all true with regard to sheretz or nevela. It is not true with regard to kizayas of hames. The dead person is different. V'hamahel al panei hatumah, or somebody who's mahel, he makes an oil on top of a dead person. 1 second. So, for example, let's say you have a bug on the bottom of the swimming pool, or equivalently, if you have a dead body there, simply you have it in a dark spring somewhere in a deep dark cave. Okay, and the halacha would be as follows: if it's a bug, the guy would be tahar. If it's a dead body, then he would be tummy. Okay, the called over shemitame milmala kilamata. Okay, this is another interesting thing. This is called zav. Zav has a tumah called nidrus and reishav. Basically means as follows: if let's say you line up 10 pillows, and the zav sits on top of one, they all become tummy. That means the tumah of a zav goes down. Similarly, let's say you cover, let's say you cover a zav with 15 blankets. Top blanket's tummy. So it goes up, right? It goes up and down. So this type of tummy as well. If a guy if let's say we have a question whether I don't know, the zav is floating on top of the water or something, and we're not sure whether he wasn't, we're not sure if the guy was touched what was underneath the zav. We'll say the suffix is tummy. That type of tumah we call tumah davar shemitame malmalak lamato. Things that
I'm sorry, all the blankets in between,
all the
Tummy,
are for sure tummy. Yeah, but even if we have a suffix tumah, we'll also say it's tummy.
The princess and the pea.
Princess and the pig, there you go.
Leisi zava v'zava, to include the categories of zava and zava that have tumas mishkav and meishav. They also these type of suffix tumas are tummy. Now, in general, by the way, suffix tumah and b'rshus hayach, it's always tummy. Means that
Okay,
if you have
slower again.
if you have a doubt whether we'll discuss it in 29 days, I believe. It's Daf Chavav in Masechet Sotah.
Mark my calendar. We'll hold you to that.
You can. It's going to be roughly a month. We will learn that there's different. That if somebody does not know if it became tummy, it depends whether it happened in a public place or a private place. In a public place, it's always tummy. It's always tahar. In a private place, it's always tummy, with the exception of the items listed here. So these things are these type of sfekas of doubts would be tahar even in a private domain. Whereas everything else would depend whether it was a public domain or a private domain. Okay. Boy Ram Rachama. Ram Rachama had the following question. Now, Ram Rachama's questions extend to the bottom of the page. And the in summary, the question is as follows. Two things are floating together. Okay, or maybe one thing is floating on top of another thing. And the question is, what do we look at it? How do we view it? Is sort of the question. So, for example, the first scenario is we have a dead body that's floating, let's say, in a casket in the water. Do we say that, look, the dead body's in a casket, it's fixed? Or do we say, no, the dead body's floating? If it's floating, it's tummy. If it's fixed, it will be tahar. Because then we look at the vessel as floating, and the floating vessel is going to be tahar.
Relative absolute.
What was that?
Relative or absolute.
Yeah, and the Gemara will just continue going with more examples of this type of question. 1 second. Okay, it's the opposite. Okay, 1 second. Okay, the Ravon here has a very interesting point, which is that the first scenario, which is with a dead body, is talking about a scenario where there's no tumas oihel. So this one's pretty easy. So you presume a dead person in a casket. The question is not whether he went underneath or above the casket. That he knows he didn't do. The only question he has is if the casket touched him. So, and because there's no oil here, so therefore, this is considered tumah. That's a floating tumah, which would be tahar. If we consider it to be if we consider the 1 second. If we consider the dead body to be floating, so it's a floating tumah. But if we say that because it's in a casket, so it's not floating anymore, so that even though the casket's floating, so therefore that's considered suffix tumah that's on land, and that would be tahar. That would be tummy. Okay.
It's fixed.
So let's begin here.
Right.
Boy Romi Bar Chama, about a third of the way down. First one on the line is Chama. Okay. So Mace Bekli, Uklit Saf Amayim. You have a dead body in a casket, let's say a vessel, and the vessel's floating. Mahu. What's the halacha? Basar Kliyas Linan. You go based on the vessel. Basar Misas Linan. Or do you go based on the deceased? So in other words, do you say this it's a floating body, or do you say it's a floating vessel? The deceased is in the vessel. You say that it's a floating vessel, so then the deceased is in the vessel is fixed, and therefore that makes a suffix tumah. That would make you tumah because it's no different than on land. Whereas if you say the body is floating, then it would be tahar. If you say we go based on the vessel, meaning the body is fixed in the vessel, I'm not exactly sure the scenario, so I'll make one up. Let's say we have a kazayas of a dead body floating on top of a mouse. The question is as follows: Kivan the high tumas erev, high tumas shiva, command macha tumah b'klidamia. do you say that since the dead body has much more severe tumah than the tumah of a mouse, so therefore we say the mouse is considered the vessel of the dead body, in which case the dead body is not floating, it's fixed, maybe tummy. Or do you say it's one thick piece of tumah, and they're both floating. The tumah item is floating. It's one piece of tumah because they're both tummy. The imtim salamer, if you'll say, command mach the tumah b'kli damya, it's as if the tumah is resting in the kli. In other words, you consider the mouse to the dead body as a kli. And therefore v'tamei v'adai, and you'd certainly be tamei. Hold on a second. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Sheretz agabe nevela. If you have a sheretz on top of a nevela is an animal that was supposed to be slaughtered but ended up being killed. A nevela tzafa, and the nevela is floating. So you have a big rib steak from a dead cow who wasn't slaughtered, and on top of that is a piece of human flesh. Mao, what's the halacha? Even the travayu tumas erev inun. Since they're both tumas erev, tumas semechtahi. 1 second. Even the travayu tumas erev inun. Since they're both tumas erev, in other words, the sheretz and the nevela both have the same tumah status. So therefore, tumas semechtahi, it's considered one thick piece of floating tumah, which is tahor. A sheretz has a smaller shear. The measurement of a sheretz is as big as 1 grain of barley, tiny sheretz. So therefore, because the measurement is more significant, so therefore it's considered its own identity, and it's considered fixed on top of the rib steak. So I'm sorry, it's a sheretz. So we're looking here at a mouse on top of a rib steak. So the mouse is considered fixed, and therefore if you touch the rib steak, if we have a suffix whether you touched it, you'd be tamei because of the mouse. Ideal more, you say no, even the mifskim yadodi loy. 1 second, hold on. I'm sorry. Or do we view it as one piece of floating tumah, in which case you'd be tahor? Because floating tumah is tahor. 1 second. Now we have sheretz lagabe sheretz. You have a salamander that's on top of a mouse. Mao hani vadechad shiurinu. These are identical tumahs, so it's one piece of mouse lizards, and it's the same item, and therefore it's floating tumah, that's tahor. Idilma, or do we say even the mifskim mehadadi, that because they're separate, in other words, the two separate items, there's a mouse and there's a lizard, so loy, they're considered separate. One's considered resting on the other one, and therefore it's considered fixed tumah, which is tummy. The imtim salamer, if we say sheretz like have a sheretz, kim the mifskim mehadadi command the macha b'kidami. If you say that one sheretz on top of another sheretz, right, a salamander on top of a mouse is considered, the salamander is considered resting in a vessel, and therefore someone who's suffix if he touched it is tamei, because you don't have the leniency of floating. So then, what about sheretz lagabi nevela shenimucha?
Rabbi, I'm sorry, page position, please.
5 lines in the bottom of the page. We'll pause here for just a moment. I'm sorry,
Okay.
6 lines in the bottom of the page. First one on sheretz. Pause here for next. The next 3 questions are as follows. The next 3 questions are scenarios where there's some sort of disintegrated liquid mush that's sort of floating on top. We'll soon see why it would be floating. But so you have you have basically a liquid, but it's concentrated at the top for whatever reason. We'll see 3 examples, I believe. And then you have sheretz in that liquid. Do you say, well, they're both liquids, they're water and some floating liquids, right? So this, the first example is nevela shenimucha. That's sort of a disintegrated flesh. That's sort of like, floating around like you might expect, and on top of so you say it's the spring is all liquid, so it's considered one unit, and the mouse is floating on top of the liquid. Or you say no, the liquid on top, the disintegrated flesh liquid, because it's sort of in one place and it looks, it has one identity, it's not blended in, so it's considered as if it's a vessel. And if there's a suffix whether or not the guy touched it, he would be tamei, because the mouse is like it's inside a vessel of this disintegrated flesh liquids.
Hi, okay.
You understand the question? And they will give 3 examples of these types of liquids. So disintegrated flesh isn't really water, right? It's sort of maybe it is water, but it's I don't know. It's like this fine pieces of mush that's suspended
I'm
inside
still working on getting past being utterly repelled, but I'll get back. I'll get on
As long as-
back with the main.
as long as you don't touch it. Sheretz gabin avela muchas. You have a sheretz on top of this disintegrated flesh. Mahu kivan dini mucha havile mashka. Do you say since it's disintegrated, it's like it's a liquid, and therefore it's part of the spring, and it's not a vessel? The sheretz stands alone. It's a floating sheretz, which is tahar. Idil mahai ochlu. 1 second. Yeah, since sort of it was edible, or maybe it is edible, it's considered its own item, and it's considered as if it's resting in a vessel, which is no different than resting on land. The imtim slammers ochlu, if you say because this was edible at some point. What about sheretz lagabe shifazera? You have a mouse that's on top of semen. So the question therefore is also the same thing. So it's sort of congregated on the top. Mahu. What's the halacha? But imtim slammers kivin dem sakra havaleki ochlo. Because shechva zera is sort of ejaculated, so it's not like it would be different than some other water analog like urine or something like that, and therefore it also stays in one place. So therefore it's considered as if it has its own identity, and therefore if the sheretz is on top of it, it's like the sheretz is in a vessel. What about mechatos? Sheretz lagabi mechatos. So mechatos is a liquid that's used to liquid from the chatos paraduma. 1 second. Yeah, and that create and that could under certain circumstances that creates a tumah. And you have this mechatos, which is thicker because it has ash inside of it, that's sort of floating on the top of the water. That obviously began as water. You just added ash to it. There was no ejaculation to create it. So therefore, it's something mahu. What's the halacha with this floating ash, this thick ash that's floating on top of the rest of the spring, and the mouse falls into it. Mahu. What's the halacha? Is it considered 2 separate things, or is it considered one thing? If it's considered 2 separate things, then you would become tamei if there's a suffix, a doubt whether or not you touched it. And it's considered one thing. In other words, the water together with the mechatos is considered one unit. So therefore, the mouse is a floating mouse, and it's tahar. Tahar, if there's a doubt whether or not you touched it. If you certainly touched the mouse, you are certainly tamei. Okay, let's be.
I'm not getting anything out of it. I'm not going near that spring. Forget it.
Sorry? Yeah, the punchline. This gemara is tegu. Take it, let it stand. Okay, we're a little bit late. We'll begin.
This gemara run screaming in the opposite direction.
Okay, we'll begin.
What's the matter, Stan?
Begin the next gemara is also a little bit complicated.
Mine comes up with all this.
I'm a Rav Hamnuna. This is typical for Kachim. No, it's not Kachim, it's with the Haras. The next gemara is Kachim. Okay. I'm Rav Hamnuna. Rav Hamnuna said, Nazir v'oisa Pesach sheholchu b'kever atahaim. A Nazir and somebody who makes a carbon Pesach that walked over a secret caver, b'shvi shalahen, on the 7th day of their process to become pure. So 7th day means they became pure. They went to the mikvah, they had the mechatos. Now what do they need? They need 2 nightfall, harav shemesh, the sun to come down. Tahirim, they're tahar. My taimo, delay alima tumas tahirim lemister. Tumas tahirim will not make them retroactively tamei, even though technically speaking they're not fully tahar because they need harav shemesh, but they're tahar. Mosiv Rava asked from our Mishnah, Yorad li tahar mitumas ameis tamei shecheskas tamei shecheskas tahar. So Rava says in our Mishnah, if a guy goes over a secret tumah on the 7th day of his nazirus, so he was a nazir tamei, right? He became tamei as a nazir. Then he purified himself. He went to the mikvah. He thought the mikvah was making him pure. It turns out at the bottom of the mikvah is a secret tumah. He finds out about it a year later. Doesn't make a difference. We say that he's tamei. Why? Because he was tamei before he went to the mikvah. His previous status is tamei. We say remain tamei. Now hold on a second. In a moment, the way a Nazir Tameh becomes Tahar is first he goes to the mikvah, then he shaves his head, then he waits for nightfall. So this seems to contradict the opinion of Rav Hamnuna. Amar Lei, so he says to him, I agree to you with a Nazir that didn't cut his hair yet. In other words, as follows: if the Nazir went to the spring and then finds a secret Tumah a year later, so he was Tameh before he went to the spring. You want to say he became Tahar, but now we have a secret Tumah, we say remain Tameh. You gotta redo the whole thing again. However, let's say, and the reason for that is because he didn't shave his head yet. But let's say he went to the mikveh, he shaved his head, and then he was walking down a road an hour before nightfall, and he walked over a secret tumah. And he finds out about it a year later. In that case, we said the only thing he was missing was hair of shemesh, and therefore he remains tahar.
All you're missing was hair of shemesh. What's that?
Hair of shemesh, sunset,
Okay. Right.
nightfall. So in other words, there's a difference by Nazir whether or not the tumah we're talking about is before he shaved his head or after he shaved his head on the seventh day. If it's before he shaved his head, we say you remain tameh. But if it's after you shaved your head, you say you're tahar.
But if he remains tummy, he thinks, since he doesn't know it, he thinks he's okay,
True, and he brought his karbanis and he found out a year later, and he has to do it over again.
even a year later.
In a year later, even 5 years later, or 10 years later. Okay, Amar le Rova. Rova says, "Afano Medina l'cha ba'isa Pesach." I agree with you with regard to making Pesach. The loy mechusar v'loy klum. There's nothing missing. Once the seventh day, he's gone his hazal. He's gone to the mikvah. He's gone to the mikvah. There's nothing missing. He is tahar. Okay, Amar le Abai. Abai asked, "V'mechusar harav shemesh." What about the fact that he's missing sunset? Amar le. So Abai responds, "Shimshum emela orva." The sun sets on its own. I'll just finish the next Gemara. Abaya also changed his mind. The Tanya we learned. We're talking here about a woman who miscarried. The general rule is as follows. We'll see if it's obvious here. We're talking about where a woman gave miscarried females, and that has to be the case. Why is that? So the rule is that when a woman becomes tahar, there's 16. Let's say she gives birth to a female. 14 days, she's tameh. The 14th day she goes to the mikvah, and then she has a tvul yom status for the next 66 days. A 40-day-old baby is old enough to have tumah if it's miscarried, it's stillborn. So what happened? We're talking about a scenario where a woman gave birth to a female child, or miscarried a female child, then miscarried again at the last day of the 80-day period. And then again at the last day of the next 80-day period. So she had three stillborns in a row. The Tanya, Yom Elois Tavi, Toich Melois Loi Tavi. So as follows. If we'll stop here. The point of this Gemara is to prove that Abaya holds that sunset does not sunset is not considered one of the because sunset happens on its own. Therefore, if person became tameh before sunset, even though there's still some residual tumah, he still remains tahar with regard to tumah at time. And we'll explore that more tomorrow.
We saw it a few more minutes.
Oh yeah, right.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. I thought I'm sorry. I thought it was Thursday. I thought we were going late. Okay, I'm sorry. Completely forgot. Yeah, let's continue. We can finish this for sure. Okay, Abaya also changed his mind. The Tanya we learned, Yom Elois Tavi, Tech Melois Le Tavi. Okay, 1 second again. Okay, again, if the woman had a stillborn on day number 79, right? Again, remember, it takes 40 days for there to be tumah with regard. A woman has to have been expecting for 40 days for there to be tumah. The tumah of a female is going to be 14 days plus 66 days for a total of 80 days. At the end of the process of at the end of those 80-day period, the woman brings a carbon, and carbon yeledes, and then she is full-fledged tahara. So if she goes to the mikvah on day number 14, she has a 66-day tvul yom status, sort of residual tumah. But by the way, she doesn't have to go to the mikvah on day 14. She can go to the mikvah on day 80. That's perfectly fine. And we'll soon see the Gemara actually is going to be talking about a scenario where she went to the mikvah on day number 80. Okay, now if she gives birth, if she has multiple stillborns within that 80-day period, she brings one set of korbanos, one korban yeladas. That this would be true even if she has two stillborns. So she has one stillborn day number 7, just one stillborn. Day 79 has another stillborn. Day 79 of that one has another stillborn. All females. We'll see by male, it's a 40-day period. So it's 7 plus 33. Now, obviously, it's impossible because a woman can't become pregnant the next day. So this wouldn't be, none of this would be relevant if any of them are male. I'm sorry?
The stillborns would be resolved. I mean, potentially triplets and they came out one at a time.
No. Doesn't appear to be the case. It appears to be that she became pregnant 40 days after having a miscarriage.
Okay.
Or within 40 days. Okay. So the Tanya will Yom Elois Tavi, Tavi. If she miscarried on the 80th day, so she brings a different set of karbonis. But if it was 79, it's one set of karbonis. Yachaloi Tavi Aleida Shel Fnei Melois, Aval Tavi Aleida Shel Achar Melois, Betifter Mishtayim, Talmud Leimer Melois Yimei Tahara. Yom Elois Tavi, Taich Melois Loi Tavi. 1 second. Okay, so in other words, what about in a scenario where there's woman has 3 stillborns, right? One after another, each one on day 79. I would think she, because the third stillborn is a different 80-day period than the first stillborn. So I would think that she'd have to bring her own set of karbonis. So Rav Kahana says, Rav Kahana, Shani Hacha, the Mechsor carbon. That in the 80-day, even though it's not 80 days of the first, it's not within 80 days of the first stillborn, right? It's what is it? It's 158 days later, right? She had a stillborn, 79 days later had another stillborn, 79 days later had another stillborn. So 158 days later, it's not within an 80-day period. I would think she'd have to bring a second set of korban yeladas. Says Rav Kahana, no, because she was never yet able to bring her korban because she never ended her 80-day period. She had a 79-day period. Then the next 80-day period, that 80-day period was all of a sudden extended because she had another stillborn. So therefore, she only brings one korban. 1 second. Okay. Now the Gemara is the following question. Let's say her middle miscarriage happened in day number 80. What would the halacha be? That she would bring 2 separate sacrifices. She would bring one for the first miscarriage, one for the second miscarriage, and the third miscarriage would be combined. So it would be the first miscarriage would have its own korban, second and third would be combined. The problem is as follows. She could not have brought her korbanos that day. She brings her korbanos on day number 81. Right? Hold on a second. 1 second. Give me a second. 1 second. 1 second. I'm sorry. Hold on. Sorry. No, it would be okay, as follows. It would be day number 81. So if it seems that 80 days is included because her korbanos are brought on day number 81. So the Gemara presumes as follows. Let's say she didn't go to the mikvah until day number 81, when she was about to bring her korbanos. And then she went to the mikvah on day number 81, or she didn't go to the mikvah. 1 second. No, you should have to wait another day. Let's show into the 1 second. 1 second. Okay. So on day number 81, even though she didn't go to the mikvah, even though the sun hasn't set yet, which she needs in order to be able to bring her korbanos, it's still considered a separate period. Now, technically speaking, she can't bring her korbanos because she never went to the mikvah and the sun never set in her. And despite that, so going to the mikveh, we could say is not an obstacle because she could always go to the mikveh. So that's what we consider two separate units, before 80 days and after 80 days. In other words, you have an 80-day period. But what we're saying here is that it's not just 80 days, it's 80 days and the fact that you're able to bring your karbanos. Okay, now the 80-day period, fine. And you could bring your karbanos. Hold on a second. In order to be able to bring your karbanos, you need to go to the mikveh and you need sunset. Let's say she didn't go to the mikveh. Okay, so going to the mikveh will say she could always go on her own. So that's not considered an obstacle since she's always able to run to the mikveh. We don't view that as sort of permanent obstacle. And therefore we separate day number 81 from day number 80. But what about the fact of Harav Shemesh, of sunset? Ultimately, if she didn't have sunset and that's not in her control, then it would seem that we'd have to wait until she went to the mikveh to separate the units and say that from till day number 80, any miscarriage she has is part of the first count, and from day 81 and onward, it's a second count. We're saying that would be true even if she didn't go to the mikveh, and therefore the sun never set on her after she went to the mikveh. Well, hold on, why is that? The sun ultimately didn't set on her after she went to the mikveh. Must be that is not considered an obstacle. And despite that, 80 and 81 are split intrinsically. Even though there's the intrinsic split of 80-81 is the actual ability to be able to bring karbanos, and that only happens when she goes to the mikveh and the sun sets. The fact that the sun sets automatically, sort of every day, intrinsically, and she's always able to go to the mikveh, neither of those are considered obstacles. And therefore, the split of 80-81 is legitimate, even though it's defined as actually being able to bring karbanos. A woman in day number 81 is always actually able to bring her karbanos, even if she can't. It's just considered a technical problem. And therefore, but you see from here as well that Abaya holds that sunset is considered sort of an automatic thing that's not considered a permanent obstacle in terms of dividing things. Okay, it's complicated, but if you look at the pictures for the next mission of the bottom of the art scroll,